In this video, you'll be setting up the very first endpoint for our REST API. Now, the goal of this video and the next one is to focus on our endpoints that involve resource creation, so creating new users and creating new tasks. Together, we'll work on creating new users, then in the next video as a challenge, you'll be setting up the ability to create tasks on your own. Let's get started by installing a few things we've used before. We're going to install NodeMon as a dev dependency, and we're going to install Express as a regular dependency. So down below from the terminal, npm I, we'll first install NodeMon at the latest version 1.18.9, followed by the save dev flag to save NodeMon as a development dependency. Then we're going to go ahead and run that, and before we actually write any code, we'll also take a quick moment to install Express into the Task Manager app. Once that's in place, we'll focus on creating the Express server and setting up the very first endpoint. Down below, we're almost done installing NodeMon. Now, one other thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to refactor the Mongoose file. We're not going to leave our model definitions inside of here. We're going to create separate files for those as well, so we're staying nice and organized. As we build out the Task Manager app, we'll talk about directory structures that scale well. Down below, npm I express at the latest version, that is 4.16.4. Now, once that's installed, we'll actually be able to use both of those tools. Let's go ahead and set up the file that's going to start up our application. So inside of the source directory, we're going to go ahead and have a new file, index.js. This is going to be the starting point for our application, and this is where we're going to initialize that Express server. Now, we also have this MongoDB file sitting around that's not going to make it into the final version of our application. You can choose to leave yours around, or you can just download the lecture zips if you ever wanted to remember what we did there. And remember, that's all documented in the PDF guide as well. So I'll take a quick moment to delete mongodb.js. I'll be kicking things off in index.js by loading in Express. I'm going to require it, grabbing the contents like we had done before. Then I'm going to go ahead and create the new Express application, const app equals, where we call Express exactly like we had set up in our web server project. From here, we'll go ahead and define the port. Now, eventually, we are going to deploy this to Heroku, so right away, I'll get the port value by looking first at process.env.port, which we know is what we need to do in order to get our app working on Heroku. Then if that doesn't exist, I'll fall back to something I can use for local development, like port 3000. Next up, all we need to do is use app.listen right here. App.listen. I am going to listen on port, and then we can provide our message right here. Something like console.log, server is up on port. Then I'll go ahead and just concatenate on the port value. Perfect. So we have the basic server in place. We're also going to set up our package.json scripts. We want to make sure we can easily use NodeMon, and now that it's installed, we can set it up in a script. I'll be removing the test script, and we'll be setting up two. We're going to set up start, and we're also going to set up dev. Now, the dev script is going to be similar to what we had before. I'll be using NodeMon to start up the file in source, that is source/index.js. Now, we won't be using handlebars in this project, so there's no need to provide that extensions argument where we listed out JavaScript files and HBS files. This alone is enough. Now, when it comes to Heroku starting our application, it'll just use the node command to start up the same file, that is node source index.js. Excellent. So now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and start up our server and go through the process of actually adding our very first route. Down below, I'll be running that dev script, npm run dev. Now we should see our message that the server is up and running on port 3000, and it is, but if we visited it in the browser, we wouldn't see anything because we haven't configured the Express application to actually do anything. If we were setting up a GET request, we would use app.get to configure that. That would allow someone to access the given route using the GET HTTP method. Now, in this case, we're trying to use post for resource creation, and for that, we use app.post. So right here, Express provides us with methods for all of the HTTP methods we're going to use. We also have app.delete and app.patch, which we'll be using as we continue to add endpoints. Now, right here, all of those have the same exact call signature. So the first is still the path, and the second is still our callback function, which runs when someone tries to access that particular route. We get access to the request and the response exactly like we would have if we were using app.get inside of that weather web server we created. Right here, though, we're going to set up the URL for this particular post request. Now we're creating a new user here, so that would be /users pluralized. Inside of here, we can now go ahead and just send back a little test response, response.send testing perfect. Let's go ahead and save this and get this to show up in Postman before continuing on. So over inside of Postman, I'm going to create a brand new collection right here in the collections menu. We have one dummy collection for the weather application. I'll create another collection for the task app. Now there's no need to configure anything in these menus. We'll talk about some of this later. For now though, we can just create that bare bones collection. From here, we're going to add our first request into the task app collection. I can click the little menu. I can then click create task or add request, and once we add the request, we'll be able to actually configure it. Right here, let's pick a name for this. I'll use something like create user, and down below, it's automatically selected the collection right here, task app, which is perfect. Next up, we'll save that brand new request. We will click it, which is going to crack it open in the Postman interface. Now, we're going to go ahead and configure the URL to what we just set up. That's localhost 3000, this is where our server lives, /users. Now, when we fire this off with the get HTTP method, we're not going to get anything back. If I fire that off, Express is going to send back a 404 saying that there is no route handler for what you tried to access. We explicitly used app.post, which means that we can only access this via the post HTTP method. Right here, I'm going to click it, switching from get to post. Then I'm going to go ahead and send this off. When I do that, we'll actually get our testing message showing up. So at this point, we're able to run the given route handler. The question is, how do we provide the data necessary? Things like the email, the name, the password, and other attributes we might want to send from the client to the server. As we saw a couple of videos ago when we broke down what makes up an HTTP request, we learned that we'll be sending our JSON data via the request body. Now, Postman gives us a way to configure that via the body tab right here. So I'm going to switch over from params, which is the default, to body. Now, by default, none is selected. We're going to switch that over to raw. Then from the dropdown, we'll switch that over from plain text to JSON, allowing us to send JSON data from Postman over to the Express server. This is where we're going to provide everything we need in order to create a new user. That would be the name, the email, and the password. The other attribute, age, is completely optional and doesn't need to be provided here. So let's go ahead and get that done. I will first set up name as JSON. So remember, we have to have our properties in double quotes as well. I'll just use my name for this. Then I'll go ahead and set up email, and I'll use andrew@example.com. And after that, I'll set up the final one we have to provide, which is password. And I will use something like red123!! Then I'll use the $. Perfect. So now we have our data set up correctly, and if I click send, we're going to see that the data does get sent off, and down below, we are still getting our little message and things are going well. We have our 200 status code, which means that things went okay. From here, the question is, how do we actually get that data so we can use it to create the new user? This is a two-step process, and the first is configuring Express to automatically parse the incoming JSON for us so we have it accessible as an object we can easily use. We do that by setting up a call to app.use to customize our server, and Express provides us with something to pass in. Right here, we use express.json, calling that as a function. When we set up this one line, it's going to automatically parse incoming JSON to an object so we can access it in our request handlers. Right here, we can do that using request.body. All I'm going to do for the moment is dump that to the console so we can look at exactly what we get. Right here, I'll dump request.body. I'm going to save the file so NodeMon restarts, and I'll fire off the exact same Postman request from the Postman application. Now, I'm not getting anything new in the response, which is okay, but over in the terminal in Visual Studio Code, I should see my data, and right here I have it. I have the name, email, and password exactly as they were provided in Postman. So now we know how to grab the incoming body data, and we can use it to actually create a new user. To get that done, we have to make sure that Mongoose connects to the database, and we need to get access to our user model from inside of this file. That's going to require us to do a little bit of restructuring as to what lives inside of mongoose.js. In here, we're just going to have the code necessary to connect to the database. We're going to move our models to other files. For that, let's create a new directory in the source folder called models. This is going to sit alongside of the DB directory, and in here we'll have a single file for each of the models we want to create. Right now, we'll have just one, which I'll call user.js, and in the next video, you'll be breaking out the task model in much the same way. So what's going to go inside of user.js? Well, the entire user model, from the const declaration all the way down to the end after we define all of the attributes. I'm going to take that, I'm going to cut it out of its current location, and I'll bring it over to user.js. Now inside of here, we are indeed using Mongoose, and we are also using that validator library, so both of those needed to get loaded in as well. Over inside of mongoose.js, I can simply grab the two existing require lines, and I can bring them over to the new file. Now we can go ahead and make sure that we actually export something from this file. Down below, we want to export user, so other files like index.js can use it to create new users. Way down at the bottom of the file, we'll get this done by setting module.exports equal to uppercase U user. Perfect. Now we're done with this file, and we can go ahead and save it. Over in mongoose.js, we have a little extra code. Validator is no longer being used in this file, so I can go ahead and remove the require call. I also have some example code where we learned how to create new instances of our models and save them. I'm going to remove that for user, and I'm also going to remove that for task down below. For the moment, we'll leave the task model exactly where it is, as we're not going to touch that in this video. So now, what do we need to do? Well, we need to head back to index.js and load a couple of things in. The first thing I want to do is require the Mongoose file. So from index.js, that would be ./db/mongoose. Now we don't want to actually grab anything from that file by simply calling require. That's going to ensure that the file runs, and it's going to ensure that Mongoose connects to the database. The next thing we're going to do in index.js is actually load user in. Right here, const user equals another call to require ./models/user. Excellent. Now with this in place, we can create a new instance of the user inside of our route handler, and we can make sure that they get saved correctly. The first thing we're going to do is create a new user. So const user equals a new user. Now we know the constructor function for our models requires us to pass in an object with all of the attributes we want to set up. And in our case, we already have an object that has all of those attributes, as we just saw. That is request.body. Now from here, we can actually go ahead and call user.save to attempt to save the new user. It might work, it might not. Either way, we want to give it a try. Down below, I'll set up a then call to handle successes, and I'll set up a catch call to handle errors. So .then with a callback function, then .catch with a callback function, and in both we're going to respond to the individual who made the request. Now, when things go well, we're just going to send back the user with all of the additional fields. The age has been set to its default, and an ID has been generated for us. Right here, we'll use response.send to get that done. What are we going to send back? I'm going to send back the user. Perfect. Let's go ahead and test this out before actually going any further. Now, in order for this code to run, the data we send across needs to be valid. This data is indeed valid. We can go ahead and click that send button. And right here, I can see that I have the entire model showing up. I have all of the attributes we provided, including the additional ones that were generated for us. Now, the new user we created was actually saved to the database. I can prove that by heading over to Robo3T. From here, we have our users collection. I'm going to go ahead and refresh it. I'll expand the last document, and this is exactly what we just created. So there we go. That is our very first REST API. We're able to send data via an HTTP request off to the Express server. Using a predefined operation, we're able to perform some sort of manipulation on the database, in this case, creating the user. Now, we still want to handle errors as well. If something goes wrong, we will get access to the error, and we'll be able to send that as part of the response. To do that, we'll use response.send, sending back the error just like this. Now, when it comes to sending back errors, we also want to change the status code. So let's go ahead and view the current output if we generated an error. What I'm going to do is provide a password that's too short. I'll get rid of a bunch of characters, leaving just 2 characters as part of the password. And if I go ahead and send this off, I would expect it to fail. Right down below, we are indeed getting the message. The path password with the value RE is shorter than the minimum allowed length, which is 7. So right here, that is indeed a problem, and we're getting the error sent back, and no new user has been created. Now, the status code is still a 200, which is a bit misleading. When we're working with REST APIs, we want to provide the most accurate status codes possible. For a complete list of all of the status codes we can work with, we can head over to the browser and go to a really neat little website. It is http://statuses.com. Here we can view a complete list of all of the common status codes we can provide. Now, our HTTP status codes are broken into different groups. They're all in the hundreds. We have our 100 status codes, which are informational, our 200 status codes, which are for success, 300 for redirection, 400 for client error, and a 500 for server error. Now, for our REST API, we'll be using 200 status codes when things go well, such as when you provide user data to create a user and we're able to create it. We'll be using 400 status codes for when things go wrong because of something the client did, such as providing invalid data. And we'll be using 500 status codes when something goes wrong because of an error on the server. So in this case, for an invalid password or any invalid user data, we want to use a 400 status code, and we're going to go ahead and use 400. For each of these status codes, you can actually click on it to learn more about it. So right here, each of them have an individual page. Now, to set up the status code, we use the status method on response. So right here, I can use response.status to set the status equal to 400. Now, it's important that we do this before we call response.send, otherwise the status isn't going to get sent correctly. Now let's go ahead and move back over to Postman and fire off that request one more time with the broken password. Right here, we can see the status was changed to 400, which is fantastic. Now, we don't have to use 2 statements to get that done. We can chain together our method calls. So I can use response.status.send to send back the error, and that makes this other line irrelevant. So right here, we have the exact same setup using a single line, and we'll be taking advantage of chaining when it's available. Right here in Postman, we can send this off for the final time, and we get the exact same result. We're still getting our response body, which is good, and we're still seeing our new status code. Now that's where I'd like to stop for this one. In this video, we set up our very first REST API route, the route for creating a new user. We saw how we could refactor the Mongoose file to focus on just connecting to the database, and we now defined the model user in a separate file. Down below, we use it inside of our route handler. In the next video, you're going to do something similar, but for tasks. You'll be setting up a new route for creating a task. I'm really excited to get to that challenge and give you some more hands-on experience, so let's jump right into that.